morning, everyone, and welcome to the 90th episode of the Veritas fact-finding series. And this morning, I have the pleasure to be joined by Mr. Flavio Volpe, the president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. Good morning, Flavio.
Thank you for having me again.
Surfacing facts and revealing truths is a never-ending quest for us at Veritas. In each episode, we go on the ground to speak with industry professionals in an unscripted, candid video format to discover how we can make better investment decisions. In this series, and with everything we do, we believe the truth comes from the facts, and that facts empower investors, and that better information leads to better investment decisions. By way of background, my name is Anthony Scilipoti, and I'm the president and CEO of Veritas, which is an independent equity research firm based in Toronto, Canada. And I'm proud to say now celebrating almost 22 years being 100% employee owned and operated. Quick disclaimer, this broadcast is not to be taken as investment advice, and participants or employees of Veritas Group of companies may own securities discussed in this broadcast. And while we love all our guests, and of course Flavio in particular, this session may contain forward-looking statements, investment opinions, and comments which we may or may not agree with at all. Now, quick comment about Flavio. It's amazing. I was discussing as we were preparing before the session, Flavio and I go way back. Obviously, I wore my cufflinks from our days back at St. Mike's. Where's my cufflink there? Can you see it? Can't see it. There we go. And of course, Flavio is, he was on our session back April 23rd of 2020. We're talking in the heart of the lockdown, supply chain issues. We were thinking about when we were going to sell cars again, getting employees to get paid, dealing with, amazing, when you were talking to us about getting the equipment. In fact, you guys were producing the protective equipment for production for individuals outside of those that were working in the plants. It's amazing what you did. So let's call re-engineering or retooling. That's amazing. Anyway, so yeah. I'm really looking forward to, as you discuss with us what you've done and what's happened over those 2 years, which is almost to the date. And I'm really excited as we go through this. You're obviously speaking directly with the powers that be at government. And I know that you've been involved in the NAFTA discussions historically, and most especially now with all the discussion about EV, Canada's at the forefront of what's going on globally with this new project Aero, which of course, I'm gonna not let anything slip out of the bag. I'm gonna leave that for you to discuss. So take us back. Over the last 2 years, I see it's added a few gray hairs a little bit to your beard, and I'm going to say that's probably 100% COVID. Yeah. It's not age, but it looks great. But take us through what it was like, how you guys managed, and what it means today.
Sure, I appreciate that. I get a little gray here, but I'm trying to hold the line up here. That's the tough part. The COVID disruption was unprecedented. I mean, society-wide, but in automotive especially, we shut down the entire industry for 60 days. That's no cars, no parts, no raw material shipments, nobody showing up to work. All those professional services that rely on the activity in the automotive sector, all those lenders, all that equity, idle. And it wasn't also one of these situations where you say, okay, look, we're going to plan for a 60-day shutdown. Every day was another day. You didn't know when you were going to come back. And then being as integrated as we are across the continent, and then up the different tiers of raw materials, tier 3, 2, 1, and automotive manufacturer, we had to coordinate restarting. And in that coordinated restart, you got to sit around with your competitors to some degree to make sure that everything gets going right. And that's also in terms of any maintenance that would have been deferred, both inside the factory and then in the supply chain. You know, the trucks that got to roll, the trains that had to roll, they had to be ready on one day. And it's an untold story, but it is incredible how we all got together across the continent with differing interests to do that all on one day, and we did. But 60 days lost production is not re-achievable. It is not. Yeah, we talked then when you and I sat there and said there's pent-up demand. Well, the fact of the matter is how many overtime shifts can you run?
Yeah.
how many weekends can you run? You lost it. And then during that period, automakers decided, how am I going to mitigate some of the cost burdens I have? And one of the things that many automakers did was say, all these semiconductors, what am I going to do with them? So you guys hold on to them. Well, the world stayed home. And in staying home, we all got on things like this. And there was an incredible demand for electronics. And those semiconductors manufacturers, they just said, okay, well, I got a new customer. But when we came back, companies like Toyota had hedged properly. But other companies, famously Stellantis, Chrysler, FCA, and the PSA merger.
Yes.
General Motors, they had a harder time with it. And so what we saw was, instead of going back to full production, even though demand came back, we were short of the semiconductors that run many of the features in today's cars. Then there was this crazy storm in Texas. I don't know if you remember it, but it was
Of course.
yeah,
the electricity was out.
Well, all these plastic parts that we have in cars, most of the petrochemicals and the resins come from Texas. So that knocked us out. And there's just a continuous stream of dominoes that have been falling. And this industry went from this crazy, unprecedented 60-day shutdown into a series of crazy, unprecedented challenges. And somehow we're still making cars, but we're about 25% down from capacity, not because demand is not there, but because we just can't get enough of those cars made. And the coup de grace, the last one, was this Ambassador Bridge blockade that shut down the industry for 5 days. And I was the plaintiff in court getting an injunction to give clarity to law enforcement to get these crazy people out of here and let's go back to work. But for 5 more days, we were shut down again. So if you have friends in automotive and they have gray hair in their beards, it's any one of those 10 things that have done it.
Now, are we gonna, so you're right. So there's still this demand. We've seen the demand didn't go away.
Yeah.
What do you see going forward here? How are we gonna ease this pressure from all the supply chain issues, semiconductors and otherwise?
Let me speak to demand for 1 second here and just give a stat that I think that a fact that I think most people think is crazy. The average value of a used car, when you drive it, we always thought you drive it off the lot, it's worth 25% less. And then you've got this kind of mappable curve, even depending by brand,
Yes.
Well, the average value of a car has gone up, used car, in the last, over the last couple of years by an average of about 12%. So the car you have in your driveway is an appreciating asset because of the shortage of supply and this inability to meet the demand because the semiconductor issue isn't fixed. And we've been saying every quarter, they ask me, when is it going to come? I go, well, we're about 2 quarters out. We're about 2 quarters out. We're about 2 quarters out. So now you're asking me, and I think that we're 2 quarters out. And it's the easy way to give yourself some clarity on it is take a look at the companies that are building new supply. And it's very capital intensive to build a semiconductor plant, and the process of making the chips is very deliberate. And so Texas Instruments, for example, is in the middle of building new supply in the US South, and that we're expecting that to come online in the 3rd quarter this year. And coming online is different than full capacity, and it's not all for cars, but it's starting to ease the burden. But you see major car companies booking 2022 as down 10% and down 20%, and then almost exclusively because they can't get the semiconductors in.
Do you think you mentioned that they're operating right now at about 25% from their full capacity, right? So 75% of full capacity?
Yeah, that's right.
Do you think that that's something that they can, alleviate through the end of the year?
Yeah, on an annualized rate, I think by the time you get to the 4th quarter, you're going to see companies getting back to their full rate. Some companies are closer to that than others, like a Toyota. They're always rather thoughtful in their contingency planning. The other thing that's happened, and it's of course felt industry-wide, not just our sector, but the spot price of steel has gone up 3 times from its trough. The cost of logistics are up. We find 13% in short haul, 26% in long haul. fuel surcharges separate from the actual cost of the logistics themselves are in and around that same amount. What we're currently looking at is around 20%. The price of the car doesn't change. The price of the part doesn't change. And so part suppliers are having to eat, in many cases, a lot of these inflationary pressures. And so what we're seeing is the thinning of balance sheets. We're seeing really just below the surface, a lot of part suppliers talking about, I don't know how long, like especially third and second tier suppliers, I don't know how much longer I can go eating that and not sharing it with my tier ones or the OEMs. And so we're going to, some OEMs are very thoughtful, others are being actually very rigid. A company like Stellantis, I mean, it's widely reported, they came up with new terms and conditions and pushed them on suppliers this year that essentially said, if you find savings, you must pass them on. And, I mean, the principle of that is we're not going to share that in a time of extraordinary pressures. And so, for some companies that are very healthy, they'll turn around and say, Stellantis is a very important customer. We'll eat it here. There are very long arches in this business. We'll get it back on the next program. But some of the others, it's tough. And I think if we don't see some of that settling in the next couple of quarters, you're going to see some risks of failures. And you can't afford a failure in the automotive supply chain. So what happens in those failures is you get a little bit of pressure on some of the other suppliers, or their customers have to bail them out. So we're going to be in this soup for a while.
So there could be some consolidation, perhaps?
Yeah, I think so.
As some of the stronger balance sheets eat the weaker balance sheets?
Yeah, and not because they're shopping around for
No.
M&A activity. It's I want to remain a going concern, and that my third tier supplier is an Achilles heel right now.
So obviously you touched on commodity steel,
yeah.
And obviously fuel. But it's affecting copper, lithium, all the price of all the raw commodities. So right now we're not seeing. I mean, I recently visited to buy a new car, and my aunt wanted to buy a new car, so we were looking at prices. Prices have started to go up on new cars, and so there is some passing on that the auto parts guys are passing on. What do you see going forward here in terms of price escalation, et cetera?
It's actually not coming from the suppliers. So the suppliers are stuck in set contracts. So unless you get a renegotiation, unless your customer allows to renegotiate, you're stuck. What's happening is dealers are dealing with inventory, historically low inventory, and they've got fixed overhead. And they say, I usually run with 70 days inventory. I'm at a scenario where I'm at a crazy 21 days. I got to make sure I make my nut on what we have. And so you'll see that price, the MSRP, the suggested retail price, is not creeped, but price to get it off the lot has. And
so the dealers are deciding to charge more, and they can because they have less, and because they have to cover their fixed costs.
Yeah, I mean, I don't blame them all. We've got lots of friends in the dealership business. They probably employ 4 times as many people in this country as part suppliers. The auto companies are also, while they keep the MSRP where it is, their dealer invoice price comes up.
Yes.
And so they're squeezing the dealer a little bit. They're making sure they make their profit where they can. And then that dealer, if that shrinks, they're going to raise it on the other end. Part suppliers, you can't. We've got you win business with a Toyota or a Ford or a General Motors or whoever, and you've got that business for the length of that program. They might make that same Corolla for 7 years, and I mean, there are opportunities to bring back inflationary prices with some of them, but for most of them, it's a closed contract. You're the lucky guy, you got Toyota, or you're the lucky gal, you got Stellantis, but that's the business you're in.
So when you look at our big auto parts guys here in Canada, whether it's Linamar, Magna, Martinrea, et cetera, they're in long-term contracts. So what we could start to see is pressure on their margins. Is that what I'm hearing? Yeah.
And the thing that is of benefit to the largest auto parts suppliers, Canadian ones, Magna, Linamar, Martinrea, ABC, is that they are. I mean, Magna is one of the biggest in the world, if not top 3, if it's not the biggest. But the rest are exposed in lots of different markets, inside and outside of North America, in different segments, cars, trucks, niche vehicles, but then also in Asia, production in Asia and production in Europe. And so some of that they're able to hedge. The ones who I think have the most trouble are the ones, medium-sized ones. We're sitting here with 3, 5, 10 plants locally, but only in a second tier, or only to a couple of programs that are exposed just to North American market dynamics. And so those are the ones I'd be worried about. If you're stamping metal for lines for a North American manufacturer, but you're doing it for the car side and not the pickup truck or SUV side. Well, we've got a semiconductor shortage. Those are being redirected to the programs with the highest margins. Those are trucks and SUVs. And so you're stuck in this. If you're on cars and you're overexposed on cars, you got lower volume programs with less margin to go and renegotiate with the OEM, and you have to have the OEM tell you, we're happy to reopen it. If they don't want to reopen it, you're stuck. Those are the ones I'm worried about.
And the concern is, if you say, okay, I'm just not going to produce, someone will step in, right? Another parts supplier probably step in, and then you lose the rest of that contract for that production cycle.
Yeah, I don't want to oversimplify it. Everybody's got their legal guarantees in those contracts. But if you fail to produce through your fault, the way those contracts are written is that the tooling that makes that part that goes into that truck is owned by that OEM. So if you default, and they can prove that in court, they can go in and get your tooling and then just give it to somebody else. No, it doesn't work for anybody, right? You'd have to be able to pick up the tooling and bring it to somebody else who has the capacity, the manpower, and the ability to draw the raw materials required for that. But that's not a great leverage position if you're the supplier. And so there's a lot of suppliers who are saying, hey, listen, I may not deliver, but you got to make sure you got some leverage, meaning I may not deliver on this program, but you're exposed to me on 4 others. So let's be reasonable. If this is the only program I got with you, not a good bluff.
Not a problem. Got it. So this is favoring the larger players. So Magna's in actually a relatively good position, or even Linamar and Martinrea, because they're spread across.
Yeah. Everybody's feeling it, but because of the leverage they have with other programs in other markets with multiple car makers, then they're in a better position.
Who do you see winning here?
Well, I mean, it's hard. I hate to be the guy that says, you're going to win in tough times, but look, I'll pick one very well-run company, Linamar, the second biggest Canadian supplier, who has shown over the course of the last 20 years or so, Linda Hassenfratz, who steers the ship there, they're very comfortable with mergers and acquisitions in related spaces. So, for example, maybe 15 years ago, they bought the Skyjack business from Volvo. Yep. They've got an agricultural business. Yep. They've moved into the medical business during the pandemic, during what we talked about. Yep. They've just done a very celebrated tie-up with Ballard. They're in the mobility space. They understand that powertrains, whatever the fuel is, from electric to hydrogen to gas and diesel, require motors and engines and powertrains, internal components, and whether it's certified for on-road or off-road. A company like that does about $7 billion worth of business a year and a very healthy balance sheet could be the company that you might turn to as your upstream supplier to turn around and say, look, this is really tough. Is there a coupling that works? And so when you're talking to a Linamar, they've got a track record of doing that in many different streams, but also doing that in a way that the market has judged to be fair.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the supply side.
Yep.
Why don't we flip to the demand side?
Sure.
We've seen obviously interest rates rising.
Yeah.
You've talked about the increased price for used cars. That's been fantastic for lease rates, offset, of course, by the fact that you got a higher lease rate on the interest. Yeah. So what do you see happening to demand here? Because obviously it's all interlinked, right?
The world has gone back to work, and that has been true for the most part for about a year now. People use their vehicles, and with cars, the most important thing is how many miles have you put on it? Are you consuming parts? And then when you get to a point where you've consumed the parts, that the maintenance, off warranty maintenance, makes it more viable for you to get a new one, then you're out of the market into the next one. And we're seeing all of those normal attributes happening. Yes, interest rates have been rising in the last couple of cycles, but they're still at a historically low level, and that hasn't really been affecting the buying decision writ large. What's affecting the buying decision is how much are you willing to pay for the car that you want? I need a car. I go to a lot. They've got 20 cars instead of 80 cars.
Mhm.
Some of them are used, and they might be the one I want, but it's 2 years old. And I want a new car. Am I willing to pay a new car price for a used car? Because that's where the prices are at. Am I willing to take a green car instead of the white one I went to shop for? Am I willing to take the content levels, lower content levels than what I imagined? All of those are, in many cases, an opportunity for dealerships, and those are independent dealerships and larger dealership groups, to get a little bit more creative on how they cover their overhead. If you have a used car right now that is serviceable, a few years old, and you don't need it, this is the time to get rid of it. You will never recoup your investment better in history than right now. If you need a new car right now, you're stuck. I mean, you're not in a good position. And if you don't need a new car right now, I'm a car guy here saying this, but don't buy it. Don't go buy it because unless you're willing to spend more money. It's a really, really funny time to be in automotive. And it really, COVID was the first domino, but now we're 6 dominoes later that COVID is not affecting, the ongoing pandemic is not affecting the auto business, except for juggling the workforce, absenteeism and such. But otherwise, the rest of those dynamics, you can't be dumb and be in this business right now. Like, I think this is the time in this business, both on the product side, what we're developing, but also in operational flexibility. You won't last long as a dummy.
There's just so many moving parts and so much uncertainty that you need to, Monte Carlo simulate all the different inputs.
I'll quote, without naming him, the CEO of one of the bigger part suppliers who taken over the position in recent years. He said to me, "Boy, did I arrive at the wrong time." He said, instead of just concentrating on the products we make for the customers we make, it's a new fire every single day. And it's a little bit like a human body. Your back might hurt, and compensating for your back, you're gonna lean a different way, and then your knee goes, and your feet hurt, and you get a headache. I mean, in the end, you got to manage the whole thing. And he said to me, "I'm not having fun." I said, "I look forward to this my whole life. I'm not having fun." And that's where we are.
Do you see that these, both the demand issues as well as the supply issues, if you had to forecast out, would you say we're 12 months, 24 months, 18 months?
I'd say probably closer to 12, just because I see the schedules for the supply chain.
Yeah.
Sorry, for the semiconductor supply chain. The wild card is where the raw materials spot price is going, and it's hard to get a handle on them because that's a real global issue. I saw a map yesterday of all the boats, all the commercial shipping vessels waiting outside the port of Shanghai, and there's something like 10,000 of them waiting to dock. And everything is, of course, as you know, interconnected. It's a fascinating look, if stuff is stuck at sea, and the volumes that are required to ship at sea, there's no easy fix. And the stuff that's on those ships, usually from there, is raw materials.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going into the port of Shanghai, going into an upstream input manufacturer who's going to send subcomponents here. And so, it leads into that other thing that we've talked about in the past is, can you reshore this stuff? And reshoring is, there are people who will tell you, "Oh, reshoring is the answer." Okay, so how about you reshore some of this higher cost stuff? Takes you a year to ramp up, and then everything clears up, and then you're stuck with this high cost supply fixture here that is going to drag you like an albatross. Patience, patience, patience.
It's interesting. You speak of patience, and I'm not putting off the discussion. The next thing we're going to talk about the evolution, because you said new product designs, et cetera. So we're going to get the EV and all of that.
Yeah.
But before we get there, you're hinting to something that we've been talking about here in our research, and that's deglobalization.
Yeah.
And you talked about onshoring, which is essentially that comment, that point. So is this something that's being contemplated? You mentioned, is it something that you think could happen?
I do a stump speech where I take a look at economic activity that started in the early 90s with the Maastricht Treaty for the European Common Market and NAFTA. Kind of the jumping off point of what I think was
globalization.
A real thrust on globalization. Everybody, both sides of the spectrum, are it's this is the answer for especially a country like ours, but also the United States we're very tied to. And I think that there was an inflection point reached when the US failed to ratify the TPP. And the TPP went ahead without the US. And it was one of those things that, I fought it. And it was the local content requirements for automotive, for example, that kind of drive our activity were dropped to a layer that was like, well, why don't we just bring everything from Malaysia and Vietnam, who are, by the way, in the deal. And then with the election of Trump and all the circus that comes with that, the regionalist hawks also joined that administration, and really kind of in that new USMCA, higher local content requirements, driving their discussions, US, Japan, US, EU, the rise and the belligerence in the relationship of China, in particular in the relationship with the US, the absolutely tangible outlook that China will surpass the US in a lot of the metrics that really matter, I think has turned the world, those who negotiate trade agreements, those who drive those trade discussions, to a more regional approach. And I think that 25 years is over, and I think we're going to have 25 years of, are you with the US, EU, Japan sphere, the West, or are you with the Chinese sphere? And the Chinese sphere is, from a metrics point of view, is a formidable opponent. The control of raw materials, we learned during COVID that if you don't make things, you got a problem, which is, you alluded to it. We had 165 companies put up their hand and say, we'll make all of the PPEs required in this country, as well as ventilators. And we did them without a contract because it was a crisis, but it also exposed, listen, you can import the containers you get your takeout food in from China, but maybe you should do the right things here. So the Chinese have a real advantage from a raw materials point of view, the mobility of labor, at least internally for them, and the dispatchability of resources. And they're going to, in our business, they've jumped ahead of everybody in the electrification of the transportation fleet without being burdened by environmental regulations on how you extract the raw material, how you refine it and turn it into a cell. And I was in Italy last week for some meetings, and in one meeting, somebody had said to me, "Look, how do you see this electrification push by governments?" Just for us, we see it's like sweeping the floor in your house, putting the dirt outside, and saying it's clean. When you allow for the Chinese lead and production in raw material refinement for what we have to do, and I said, yeah, maybe. But I don't think governments are the push for governments now to zero emission vehicle mandates, 100% by 2035, is not a push you can push against over the next 5 years or so. They have the pen right now, and let's see how it goes. And if it starts to fail against that curve, then you can have discussions. But you can't be the one that says not going to happen. So we're in a very funny period from a supply chain point of view, but we're about to enter the most disruptive period ever from a technology point of view.
Yeah. We've had a number of, both professors and experts in the industry and talk about electric vehicles and all, of course, the electrification of the entire industry. Yeah. And it's funny, I've learned so much just about the fact that the car, just how technologically advanced. It's like a supercomputer.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, like my car, it tells me if, you know, the left low beam is off, you know, and whatever. And that's just minor things. Anyway, so as you now look to electrification, and you touched on the idea that we're going to get to zero emission by 35. I hear others say by 2050.
Yeah.
Maybe you can start by saying, by talking about where you think we are in the actual, you know, the start of that, because I know all the major players, you know, first all we heard about was Tesla. Now we know Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, etc. Everybody's in on the game. They're making F-150s that are electric. I don't know if anybody wants to drive it yet, but that's what's there. Anyway, I'll leave it to you.
Well, you know, I say 2035 because a lot of the major markets in the world, let's use this one, where the Prime Minister said our targets will be 100% of new fleet sales in 2035 will be zero emission. In the US, they've said 50% by 2030 or 100% by 2035. That is a steep slope. And if you think about whatever car you're driving, when that car comes out, we run that car for about 5 to 7 years. And so if we're 15 years out from that target, we really have only 2 generations of automotive to get there. Mm-hmm. And in those 2 generations, you've got to solve for people's, we used to worry about range anxiety. I'm not sure we worry that much about it right now. I think most of the EVs offerings out there are, you know, give you a reasonable range, 300 to 600 kilometers. But the cost of those batteries are still crazy. Use, for example, Mustang Mach-E, which is the new Ford entry, which I think is a fabulous product, which may or may not get built over here at in Oakville. I'm pointing out the window at Oakville. It has a battery pack that is just shy of, I think, $30,000. So if the battery pack is $30,000 to make sure that it meets all the you know, the specifications that a customer would want, that car is going to be $60,000. And if we're talking about 60,000, if we're talking about $15,000 batteries, we're talking about $10,000 batteries. Where a lot of the sales happen are in the A segment and B segment, the smaller vehicles. If I'm selling you a Honda Civic and I'm selling it to you, a great car with very low emissions for $18,000, where am I going to shove a $10,000 battery pack? And so we have to think about those things on our way to 100%. Honda, you know, we got to listen to Honda. Honda is turning around saying, what's your objective? Sure, we'll do electric cars. Okay, but let's have a real conversation. What's your objective? Do you want to lower the fleet emissions? Well, if we sell 100 million cars every year and each car on average puts out 4 metric tons of carbon, you have 400 million metric tons of carbon. So what if every single car's emissions went down by 75% versus 50% of the cars becoming electric? And what if in that reducing that and an internal combustion point of view or a mix of hybrids, you have a better cost matrix? And by the way, you don't have to plug them in. You know, Anthony, I don't know where you live, but a lot of people in this country live in multifamily residences.
Yep.
And others who live in single family residences live in places in urban areas that don't have dedicated parking for them. So how do we solve for charging for them? By the way, if they all plugged in, what would happen to the transformer on the street or the transmission station? How do we solve for that? I think a lot of industry analysts are saying we've seen a range between 28 and 42% of new sales by 2035, reasonably being zero emissions. You have Porsche, who says, well, part of what we have is this mystique with our current customers who like to keep their 911s alive. And if we're going to 100% at zero emissions, is the next step that we're going to turn around and outlaw internal combustion. Oh, by the way, if it's 100% zero emissions, don't we collapse the market for gas? And then how do you power those 911s? So they said, we're going to work on a 95% carbon-free synthetic fuel. And they've been very public about the fact that they've achieved it. And now it's a point of commercializing it and getting it to a point where it is a viable alternative. Well, what if it's $3 a liter? Porsche is owned by Volkswagen Group. Depending on the time of day, whether it's them or Toyota is the biggest auto manufacturer in the world. You know, I think that what we're going to see is you're going to see internal combustion for a long time. Hybridized internal combustion look at companies like Ferrari, Lamborghini, Bugatti, Rimac, Porsche, Bentley, the high end of the market, saying, we're going to deliver luxury sports vehicles in that space. Some of the technology that we deploy is going to work its way down to the other segments of the market. And by the way, you can and will be able to buy that synthetic fuel from sources like the Porsche, where it's going to cost you more money. As the rest of us go towards a 2050 maybe of 100% electrification. And I'll leave the last point. The key hook for electrification isn't, from a consumer point of view, for me, isn't, oh, it's clean transportation. I think most people don't know the difference. The key hook is, in your internal combustion engine car now, you turn it on, there's a 40-volt system that supports all of those electronic aids that we know. But in a 100-kilowatt battery electric vehicle, there's a 400-volt platform and an 800-volt platform, which will allow for connected autonomous technology. In electric cars, you can go self-drive. In electric cars, you can go vehicle as a caregiver. All those things that we say, wow, can you imagine? They're going to depend on electrification. That's what's going to pull you. You're going to turn around and say, yeah, I'll spend more money for that. But you may not spend more money for an electric Toyota Corolla than you would for a internal combustion one.
So you touched on a couple things. One, more move to hybrid.
Yeah.
You talked about the use of a different type of fuel.
Yeah.
And perhaps not even that we go to like what 100% electrification may actually just be something that's on paper and a dream that isn't even feasible.
Yeah. I think what's reasonable and noble is the objective to get to zero emissions. And I think governments, and I worked in government for a while, as you know.
Yep.
Sometimes you get caught up in dictating the technology solution. Instead, you need to articulate the problem. And then in articulating the problem, you turn around and you put out some carrots and some sticks against that problem. We want zero emissions from the transportation fleet. Now go for it. And that might be hydrogen, that might be electric. That might be a scenario where every single vehicle on the road sold in 2035 is at least a hybrid that has some distance capacity that is purely electric. So that we could say 100% of the vehicles that will do a commute can do it without gasoline. And then we start looking at the kinds of things that companies like Honda look at and say, oh, that 400 million metric tons of carbon, through that mix, can we get that down to 50? And it also has to be a kind of a culture change, and that culture change of how you use your vehicle. And so if we're going to reduce the carbon from the transportation fleet, one of the easiest ways to do it is to not use the transportation fleet. And so we're talking about urban planning. We're talking about new work cultures. We've just spent the last 2 years, a lot of us who are in office spaces, with flex space. I don't drive. Well, part of that, what's happened there is maybe your 4 metric tons has turned into 3.
Yeah.
And if we do live, work, play, we might get that down to 2.7. We haven't even touched the car yet. So it's not the burden. By the way, I'll say this: hundreds of billions of dollars are being spent by automakers who are falling over each other to say, I'm going to electrify. No, I'm going to electrify. Yesterday, we saw General Motors announce an electric Corvette. Now, I mean, I had a couple Corvettes when I was younger, and a lot of that hairline has moved because of having to maintain them and whatever. But for me, I never would have thought about an electric Corvette. They're all following each other to go to it. But if the governments in all these countries are going to say, we've got to go zero emissions, then it's got to be a society-wide outlook. Because it's not just if I make the product and you don't buy it, what do we achieve? If I make the product and you use it wrong, what do we achieve? If we all have this goal in a climate emergency, then we have to culturally change. And I just spent a week in Europe, and they treat transportation differently. Their fleet looks different, and they've had a very advanced outlook. We talk miles per gallon here, or kilometers, liters per 100 kilometers. There, they've always talked about CO2 per 100 kilometers.
Yeah.
They've been they go right to the issue. And so a lot of that is industrial planning. A lot of that, unfortunately, if you're going to compete on this in this planet, is government that's got to invest in it. The Chinese are centrally planned, but the Americans, who are the big free market, announced $180 billion into electrification of the fleet there. And so in Canada, there are a lot of people say, well, why are you giving out corporate welfare? Well, the fact of the matter is that just like if you want to compete in the Major League Baseball, you've got to pay a payroll. Otherwise, you're not a big league team. You want a big league team, this is what it costs. And you don't want to, here's what happens. Talent goes placed somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So you either decide that you're in the league or you're not. And we're definitely in the league. But we got to, we have to make lineup decisions that matter.
I want to just launch our poll so everybody can tell us what a great job you did. Just tap there, yeah, and then perfect. All right, and perfect. So, and then I have a couple of questions that have popped up. If anybody has a question, if they just scroll down to the bottom of their screen and over the question Q&A icon and punch in their question. So Flavio, there's been concern about production leaving Canada. Yep. Even during this COVID. It was actually surprising to me. I almost wanted to pick up the phone and call you because I was shocked, given that we need production and they're taking production away from Canada. Is this a beginning of a trend? Is it something that'll revert? Where do you see that moving forward?
Well, so there's two things at play. One is the shortage of semiconductors. Companies have had to decide which lines are going to get the semiconductors and which don't. And so they've ostensibly gone with, they've prioritized pickup trucks and SUVs because they have the biggest margins there and require the same amount of semiconductors that a smaller car does. In Canada, we mostly, we make more of the smaller vehicles than the larger ones. And so we've seen a 25% decrease in production with the same capacity footprint than we would have in a normal year here, where in the US, maybe some of those declines are 10%. That's really the program mix. Number two, we've seen programs come to an end here. For example, a great high volume product that was probably 20% of the production in Canada, which is the Equinox, which is made in Ingersoll, Ontario, that's been moved to Mexico. And so it's caused people concern. And then, so I look at the other side of it, and I'll tell you why I'm not concerned. General Motors has announced this bright drop vehicle. It's the only place where it's going to make its light truck, commercial truck delivery vehicle, full EV in Ingersoll. Lower volumes to start, but it's the only place they're going to do it. And once that takes off, especially with their big commercial fleet customers, all that volume will come back. But the provincial and federal government have been working together in a way that I've never seen. I've been in this space for 20 years. I've never seen them work more aggressively to get new programs. And we've seen battery electric vehicle commitment. The only battery electric vehicles are going to be made in Oakville in Ford's plant. We see a commitment from LG and Stellantis to do batteries, a $5 billion plant in Windsor. Well, they're not doing that and then moving production out of Brampton and Windsor. It means they're going to get electric cars there. We saw General Motors in Oshawa reopen the plant and start building pickup trucks. For me, I say to people, they didn't say they were electric pickup trucks, but if all of their programs are going to electric, they'll have the same amount of volume over here. And of course, Toyota and Honda have been steady Eddie. I mean, for the 30 years they've been here, they don't pull back. They don't make splashy announcements, but they don't pull back. And Toyota has committed 2 Lexus lines to Woodstock, Ontario. Ontario was the first place in all of the world where Toyota committed, the first place where they committed Lexus outside of Japan in 2005. Now there's one in Indiana. This place has its 2 top selling CUVs, the NX and the RX, and they are, they have hybrid versions and they'll be electrified. My confidence in Canadian production is bolstered by that LG Stellantis battery plant. Mm-hmm. And the fact that I know that there's 2 or 3 more that we're currently negotiating. Where you make these batteries is where you'll make the cars, because they're 800, 900 pounds. They're $25,000 packs and they don't travel well. And they're the anchors. It used to be assembly plant was the anchor. It's like, watch where they're putting the batteries. That's where they'll make the cars.
All right. Couple of questions coming in. One very topical, of course. What are your thoughts on Tesla here and its positioning in the marketplace, and perhaps where you see it going?
Wow, how much candor do you want? First of all,
direct goods.
First of all, I think as an evangelist, Elon Musk has been fantastic. He and that company and its product have been for the first 5 years, the industry, all the graybeards said, these guys will never make it. You know, they're making 50,000 cars a year. Now they did 625,000 last year. He's got this wider empire where he's been able to subsidize some of the costs on these vehicles. Up until very recently, wasn't making any money on the cars themselves, but making money on the credits that they were selling to other car makers, $2-3 billion a year. He's had this strategy where they go from top of the market, you know, very expensive Model S's now to reasonably priced 3s and Ys. Where I'd watch for Tesla is every single car company is now an electric car company.
Yeah.
And so we're going to stop calling them electric cars in 5 years. We're just going to call them cars. And so how does the Tesla product line up against Toyota or Lexus, General Motors, Cadillac, you know, BMW, Mercedes? And he's struck out a brand niche right now that says, we sell the quickest accelerating cars in the world. And by the way, we're the leaders on autonomous drive. Well, in the electric power, it's modular. And so you want to go faster? I'm going to put 4 motors on. It'll be, what is the next phase of Tesla to get the mass customer in? That current 2%, 5% of the market, they've been savage. They've been able to put everybody on their heels. There is a chance that they figure it out and they become a mass producer. For example, they make 10% of the cars that Ford makes. Forget about their valuation. On the ground, how many cars do you make? If you're not making 2, 3, 4, 5 million cars, you're a small producer. They're not in a million yet. So they could figure it out. And that means take that brand equity and put it into smaller vehicles and see if you can get them out in larger numbers. Or they could be like Napster that changed the recording industry forever. But
don't exist.
But if Napster didn't happen, neither would Spotify or Apple Music.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So, and which leads us to something that I've been kind of holding back. Talk to us about this new Aero project and what it means for both the EV or the new car, as you call it, and the future.
Sure. So Project Aero, we named it after, of course, the last time that Canada had a clean sheet on technology in the transportation space. We said, how am I going to, we'd been doing technology demonstration projects for 7 years. We take some of those Ontario-made Lexuses, and then we said to suppliers that you have commercially ready technology, connected autonomous technology, that type of stuff. We'll put them on these vehicles and we'll take them everywhere. CES, LA Auto Show, Geneva, Tokyo,
Just
wherever.
looking at questions here.
Yeah. And we said, actually just before the world fell apart in January of 2020, that I went to the throne speech invited by the Prime Minister as a guest after our NAFTA negotiation. They said, show us what you can do as an industry by to be zero carbon by 2050, but technology demonstration by 2025. So we launched a project that we said, designed, engineered, supplied, built 100% in Canada, all the components in a vehicle. And well, I was about to show you something here, but it's classified. Anybody, I almost did it. Anybody can go see where we're at. It's projectaero.ca. We did a design competition. We had 24 submissions. We picked them, chaired by the head of design for Stellantis globally. We turn around and I convinced the chief engineer for Aston Martin Special Projects to leave Aston Martin after he finished the Valkyrie to come and do this project with us. Somebody said, well, why the hell would you go do that? And I said, well, you know, if you're going to go to the moon, you need a couple of astronauts. We convinced him and someone who was a former CTO at McLaren to say, can you lead the engineering team for us? So now this car, 534 companies applied to be part of it. We've taken 55. This car will be almost 100% Canadian. The only places, and it's part of the study, where we couldn't find a Canadian supplier, and things like screens, they only get made in Asia. But this car will be the most Canadian car ever, and it's built to 2025 motor vehicle safety standards. So when you see it in December this year, our friends at Ontario Tech University are housing our build. This is a roadworthy car, and it's not a science experiment. It's not a rendering. It's not a clay model. It's a full car. You can drive it at full speed, and we're gonna take it around the world with those 55 companies who contributed to it, and those 534 that represent the Canadian space, and say, if you're going to make electric, connected, autonomous cars, the most advanced technology applications, look at all the Canadian suppliers in every single part of the space. And so I've been pre-selling it around the world. You know, I've been going to OEMs and making those introductions now. They're talking to those companies now. Wait until you see the car.
And so the idea is, you mentioned the 54 different suppliers, or
Yep.
So these would be auto parts suppliers as well as OEMs involved?
These are all auto parts suppliers, and whether it's hard supplies, you know, stuff you can touch tactily, or technology suppliers, these are Canadian companies who either have OEM contracts already or have major customers in the technology applications they have, and they want to transition into automotive. And we would take that car and we would bring that car to Tesla, and we would take it to Mercedes and BMW and GM, like we did with those Lexuses for the last 7 years, and say, hey, by the way, with the Lexus, we used to say, here's a bunch of stuff that's on a Lexus. When we bring this one, everything you touch and feel, and we went for advanced material sciences applications in the hard stuff.
Right.
Everything you see and feel, you can buy from a Canadian company. And by the way, we brought them with us.
So the idea is, this car, could I buy an Aero car one day?
I mean, if somebody with access to lots of capital wants to go into production, they can answer that question for you. But you can drive this one when it's ready. And
but I guess the point is, this is a showcase for all the parts.
That's right.
You like the handles, you like the drivetrain. Yep. Oh yeah, this drivetrain, yep, you can put that on your Lexus, you can put it on your Ferrari, we can modify whatever. Is that the idea?
Yeah, and because we're able to design this car from scratch, we turned around and said, what is the best cybersecurity application for a vehicle, both in terms of V2X and then the systems within it, and then the data that a car with an 800-volt platform with sensors and cameras generates, which I think will be a future revenue source for the car makers, or passed down to the customer themselves. How do we design it? We designed with 8 different Canadian cybersecurity firms, 4 layers of cybersecurity in this car. This car will be the most cybersecure encrypted vehicle ever made. And that sounds like a superlative, but it isn't. It's because we designed it that way. So when you go to buy a car off a lot right now, there's a lot of compromises that are made to be able to sell you something at a profitable level that you're willing to buy. For me, I'm demonstrating. Here you go. This is the car you'll be safest in.
Well, congratulations. I'm looking forward to that. So there's an unveiling in December. Is that the
idea?
Right.
That's right. Everybody who's listening now can go to projectaero.ca, and you'll see everything that I talked about there. And then, or just do a Google News search. I've probably done 200 interviews on this.
Oh, I know. And I want to come to an unveiling, or at least to see this thing.
You're invited. Nothing to talk about. December.
I'd love to be there. Flavio, 2 quick things I like to ask all our guests. Favorite book that you'd like to recommend that had a major impact on your career, and next thing is any Twitter feeds or things that you're following on social media.
I'm going to go sideways on the book piece. Okay. Here's a guy that works for me, and he's a CTO in charge of Project Aero, and he just launched his own book, a real reflection on sound, personal, the 3 houses is the individual, the family, and then get that right, and then contributions to society. When you read that, you'll know how inspired we are on Project Aero. His name is Colin Dillon. He just launched it. And on Twitter feeds, Flavio Volpe 1. You should read that one. That's a pretty good one. But Twitter is a bit of a mess these days. You know who I find has been actually Catherine McKenna, who was the former Minister of Environment. She didn't run last time. And if you read her feed now, the candor that she expresses is refreshing. You know, if you can imagine, it isn't too different from the values that she held before, but you know, someone who's had that exposure to the machine of government and lending her perspective as we go forward, especially in these issues that we just talked about, I think it's rather refreshing to see.
Amazing. Flavio, keep up the good work championing Canada and Canada's auto sector. And we'll check in with you. It won't be 2 years though. It'll probably be, we'll go a year and wait till this Aero gets launched. Maybe 12 months from now, we might be at a more equilibrium and we'll see where things are at.
You know, we'll do, and there's a promise I'll make to you. When that car is ready, let's do the next episode from that car, and I'll walk through that technology and then the orientation of that technology and why it's special to be Canadian.
Thank you.
Anytime.
All the best, Flavio.
Ciao.